Welcome to the Qualified Tutor podcast. I'm your host, Ludo Miller, and I'll be interviewing tutors and thought leaders from across the tutoring landscape to inspire, inform, and motivate you to become the best tutor you can be. The Qualified Tutor community is a safe and supportive space for tutors who love to learn and grow. We offer training, resources, ideas, and a chance to connect with like-minded tutors. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join our Qualified Tutor community at www.qualifiedtutorcommunity.org or find it in the show notes. Welcome to the next episode of the Qualified Tutor podcast. Today we are joined by Mary Myatt and of course by wonderful QT founder Julia Silver. Mary speaks for students and school leaders, pulling out practical ways in which we can alter the approach that schools take to maximise learning, to maximise personal and academic development for all those involved. Mary is proposing an improved school curriculum in which greater background knowledge is taught to children, which then allows them to learn for themselves. Combined with teaching through stories, children will learn more deeply, forming connected and long-term memories. Perhaps Mary has some good stories for us today as well. Mary, we have a huge respect for the work you do and are very, very grateful for you for joining us today. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Delighted to have the chance to chat with you.
Thank you. What does the return to school period brought for you, Mary?
Well, normally I'd be back to back with conferences, doing work in schools, but with the current situation, I've only been into 2 schools so far this term, face to face, and the rest of it is online, and it's now just back to back online. So, I mean, that does have its benefits, is in that you can actually squeeze in more, and there is a lot of demand out there for sensible conversations about the curriculum and our processes in the educational sector. But the downside is missing the vibe of being in a room full of people and interacting with them. So it's twofold, really.
Yes. Zoom rooms just aren't really the same thing, are they? So, Mary, we'd love to start with this question, which if you've heard our podcast before, then you may have heard us asking. What kind of student were you, Mary? And did you ever have a tutor?
Well, it's going to sound a bit geeky, but I enjoyed school and I enjoyed learning and I enjoyed finding out new things for myself. I have to say it wasn't until the sixth form that I really felt that we were given our heads as girls to really explore and debate and really wrestle with big material. Up until then, we were expected to be compliant and just take down the notes that, for the most part, were dictated to us. And so I think there were lots of missed opportunities for getting the best out of us, when we were lower down the school. In terms of having a tutor, so when I was in the last year of my primary school, my parents sent me for some lessons on a Saturday morning just to learn some French. So it wasn't for the 11 plus or anything like that. And I really enjoyed that, and that stood me in good stead. And then the other thing that I had, which was aligned with tutoring, but not exactly that, was that the summer before my O-levels, because I'm that ancient, the spring before my O-levels, my German teacher had said that there was a week's intensive course at King's College in London designed for people doing their O-levels stroke GCSEs. And I found that absolutely brilliant. Just loved getting in really, really deep, and some fine lecturing on the back of that. And I would only have been 15, but it made a big impression on me.
Yeah, clearly, I think we often have guests talking about those really early tutoring experiences they had and how that kind of shaped the way they approached education really from that point, even if it was just a couple of sessions. I know Julia often talks about, was it Mrs. Fisher, Julia? That's well remembered, Ludo. That's 1 point to Ludo. So, Mary, could you tell us a little bit about your new book, Back on Track?
Well, it's addressing what I see as the need for the sector to look at some of the processes that I think are getting in the way of us doing our best work. So my view is that the educational sector is quite conservative, and it has a tendency to think because a process has been done over the years, therefore it's always got to be done. And the problem with that, there are two issues really. One is that I think by and large, those involved in education are always keen to do their best work incredibly hard for pupils and students. And so there's this temptation just to keep on adding more and more. And I think leaders can sometimes be guilty of this as well. Now, it's not universal, but I think across the sector, this is the case. It's just more that we've got to do. And what I'm arguing is that we need to go back to working out what we need to do to have the greatest impact for our pupils and students. And with the latest inspection framework and the quality of education judgment, there is overwhelming evidence that a high quality curriculum, carefully thought through and sequenced, underpinned by the research that we've got coming out of cognitive science, is going to make the greatest difference for the greatest number of pupils. Now, in order to do that work, we've got to trim a lot of other stuff. And so that's at the heart of the argument I'm making in Back on Track. But I draw on sort of wider leadership thinking in order to do this. So Greg McCown's essentialism work, the Pareto 80-20 rule, William Morris's work saying, we shouldn't have anything in our homes that we don't know to be useful and believe to be beautiful. And so I'm coalescing these ideas together to try and make a strong case for cutting back radically those things which are not adding value to children's learning. So that's the heart of it.
Yeah, that's really an excellent kind of a path to forge, and really something that is so key at this time, isn't it? Especially with trying to refine kind of children's learning, kind of when it's been stripped back and when there's so much that they've lost in this time. Now,
sorry, I'm just going to come back and expand on that a bit. Yeah, so I think the result of lockdown has meant that a lot of schools, a lot of people working in education are now taking a fresh look at what is essential and what isn't. But I think one of the interesting pieces of work that's come out of the analysis of what's happened with loss of education in the past, so this is John Hattie's work, he's found when they analysed what happened with children after Hurricane Katrina and also after the Christchurch earthquake, where there was significant loss of educational time, that actually the following year that public exams were taken, the results went up. Remarkably, they went up. And then they went back to their normal levels in subsequent years. And Hattie puts this down to the fact that those who were supporting the children on whatever kind of program, either in or out of school, were focusing on what the children knew and didn't know. And so really identifying misconceptions and gaps and filling those in a very purposeful way, primarily through conversations with children, that meant that the learning became much more efficient. Because, I mean, I'm afraid to say there is time wasted in schools filling in, low-level worksheets and things like that. But when we strip that out and start really having high-quality conversations in lessons, we can move the learning on really quickly. So I think there's some quite interesting and encouraging stuff to reflect on in that example.
It's a fascinating example. I know that in school we do tend to get entrenched, don't we? We just get used to our systems and routines. And having been disrupted is a fantastic opportunity to go back to the drawing board and ask what we do and don't do. We've certainly seen in our youngest children in school a lot of readiness. And we did, and so they're going back, they'll just pick it up more quickly. And there is, of course, a lot of work to be done around anxiety because we're not through the coronavirus pandemic yet. So there's a lot of support to be done in that. And what's actually happening is that we're being forced to be more responsive than we usually are. And we talk about in Qualified Tutor about how really the magic of tutoring is in the responsiveness. You're able to be responsive in a one-to-one or a small group setting. You're much more nimble. So that's what we're seeing. That's what we're talking about at a tutoring level, but also in terms of our own mindset, to just sort of have been pushed out of our box and find new ways to follow through on. You have this lovely phrase, don't you? Moral purpose. And we talk in Qualified Tutor about finding your why, about Sinek's approach of finding your why. And if we can go right back to the vision of what our why is as educators, and then be responsive to the students in front of us, it's not a surprise that, you know, that some wonderful things could happen.
Yes, agreed.
Go ahead, Lido.
Well, kind of on that, a similar theme of how we have perhaps linked, the kind of quality pedagogical research out there into the course that we've written. It's mainly down to Julia and Adrian Conway's years of fanatical reading of educationists like Dylan Williams and yourself and
Myatt.
There are two key themes in your previous books, High Challenge, Low Threat, and the curriculum, that we refer to quite centrally in our Qualification Tutors, our 4-part course. Can you tell us and our listeners a little bit more about High Challenge, Low Threat, and about how and why tutors can support students' development of a powerful architecture of knowledge?
Right. So the thinking behind High Challenge, Low Threat is that I'm making the case that we are a challenge-seeking species, that we like doing things that are difficult, as long as the conditions are right. So just to give a quick analogy of how this might work, if I was to say to you both that in the next few minutes, the three of us would be sitting an unseen, unprepared for test. We'd just crack on and do it. It would be quite short. We just complete it and then take a bit of a break. During that time, it would be marked, and then we would be ranked between the three of us of how we'd done in that unseen, unprepared for test. So Julia's putting a thumbs down sign.
I've got to go, sorry. My stomach hurts.
and Ludo, you're ambivalent. So when I do this with large groups of people, we tend to find that most people are reluctant, but will go along with the idea of this unseen, unprepared for test. But when we realize we're going to be ranked, then that's when the stress levels and the discomfort for 90% of us, because I've done this score over 25,000 times, a huge portion of us feel very uncomfortable. About 10% of people are fine with it because there's a small minority of people who get a bit of an adrenaline rush. But for the most part, we feel very unsettled by this. Now, when you unpack it and you talk to the people, they say, all right for the test, but it's that moment of being judged that is really damaging psychologically. Now, interestingly, I'm going to do less well in the test because if I know that, I'm going to be worrying, well, how am I going to compare with my peers rather than focusing on the job in hand? But yet, on the other hand, we have a significant proportion of the population that by way of relaxation will do things like word puzzles, crossword puzzles, Sudoku, that sort of thing. And I'm arguing they're a form of test. Now, they're not literally a test, but they do share some of the same features of a test in that what we're doing there is we're putting ourselves under cognitive pressure to do something quite difficult by way of relaxation and in our own time. Now, I happen to do quite a lot of Sudoku, and what I've found is I've mastered the easy and the moderate ones, and I'm now tackling the difficult ones. Every now and then I'll go back and give myself a break by doing one of the easier ones. And what I find is that I don't get the same sense of satisfaction or pleasure from completing that I do from the more difficult ones. And what's happening there is we get a rush of dopamine, which is the pleasure hormone, which we get when we've achieved something we've had to put that bit of effort into. It's not been immediately obvious. And then when we get there, we have this deep sense of pleasure. So what's critical here is that I'm arguing that we like doing things that are difficult. We're a challenge-seeking species, as long as there's no potential for anyone to make us feel stupid or like a Muppet. So I've got to be careful because the Muppets do good work on Sesame Street, but none of us are in that situation. So the goal to be moving towards, there are two threads I'm arguing from this. One is the fact that we like doing difficult work. That's whether we're adults or whether we're children, but the conditions have got to be right. So there must be no shame or fear in getting something wrong or making mistakes. Indeed, those are springboards for new learning. And the second thread in that is that we need to be critiquing the work rather than the human being, the work rather than the human being. And so the case I'm making in high challenge, low threat, my work around that is that we can actually take on greater cognitive demands, whether we're adults or children, than we currently think, as long as that atmosphere is totally supportive, totally encouraging, totally challenging in the right way. And there's lots of things that feed into that. Radical candor, Kim Scott's radical candor. It's possible to be both robust and kind. So there's lots of threads sitting around that and underpinned by trust. So where that leads then in terms of children learning things in rich knowledge in the long-term memory, I think it's quite interesting, just by way of introduction to that part of your question, is that one of the threads of the new inspection framework and the quality of education judgment within schools is ambition. So it's the first time that ambition has been included in a framework. So one of the things we need to ask ourselves is what we're offering our children sufficiently ambitious to really stretch them? Now, the work that I've done around this in terms of children wanting to be stretched, they say they want more demanding work. And I think as a sector, we're inclined to make too many things too easy for too many of our children. They're craving to do interesting, difficult work. And there's a very nice excerpt from Alison Peacock's book, who I know you've recently done a podcast with, her book, Assessment for Learning Without Levels, which came out in 2015. And she and a colleague were interviewing some children as they were going from year 5 into year 6, and they were asking them what they thought of ability tables. But actually the children's responses were about provision. And so the top group liked being the bright ones and having special challenges set by the teacher. The middle group liked the sound of some of the challenges the top group had, but they knew they'd never get the chance because there were only 6 seats on the top table. The bottom group were really discouraged. They usually work with a teaching assistant, and this less able group wanted to try the more demanding work, but they knew they would never get the chance. So I see this repeated again and again. Children love doing difficult work. The fundamental thing that needs to be in place beyond the high challenge, low threat is they need to be successful quite early on. So there's a lovely piece of research which came out of Sussex University, and I think you probably heard me speak about this before, Julia, that where these were students in year 8, quite a small scale study where of about 360 students in a number of schools, the year 8s, and they were taught in their English lessons 2 novels. They were working through 2 novels, which would normally be at least a year above what they'd be studying. So challenging work. And in their English lessons for 12 weeks, that's all they did. They read these novels quickly and at a fast pace and discussed them. No written work expected during this. It was just getting through the material and talking about it. At the end of that 12 weeks, they found the whole cohort's reading ages had improved by 8.5 months. For the weaker readers, it was 12 months. And the research paper that sits with this, 2 very interesting things come out. When they talk to the children about the poorer readers about why they'd done so well, they talked about how they were able to get into the story in a way they're never normally offered this stuff. And so they just loved getting into this this big meaty material, and they said we didn't need to understand every word because we could talk about what we did and didn't understand. So the crucial thing there was that the children offered, all of them, material above their pay grade, but for the weak, all of them, but in particular the weaker readers, they felt a sense of accomplishment and success quite early on. Now, that is an incredible internal motivator. If I feel, oh, I can have a crack at this, oh, I've done okay, I'm going to want to do more. So I think there's some important psychological insights there. The second is that that struck out for me from this research was that the teachers were surprised at how those weaker readers had done. And I just think that is a damning indictment of our low expectations of what we can expect from our children. You know, we talk the talk of, you know, we're ambitious for all our kids. If we're not giving them ambitious stuff, it's not going to happen. So just the final thing I would say, Ludo, in relation to, you know, securing things in the long-term memory and rich knowledge, etc. I'll just give a quick example because it ties these threads together. But a lot of the work I've been doing around rich vocabulary, rich texts, Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary. So the Tier 3, that's subject-specific vocabulary that sits within the individual domains. Generally, they're big words, they're not used in everyday life, and quite often they've got roots in other languages, quite often Latin and Greek. So when we teach children how to get to the roots of those words, like isosceles, for instance, isos means equal, skeles means legs. They've got a bigger mental picture of what an isosceles triangle is rather than just parroting back the definition. Now, the interesting thing is that the schools that have been working with this, developing children's vocabulary in this kind of very active and expansive way, very light touch from a teacher's point of view, just show them how to look up the words plus etymology on Google, it throws it up. Set some of that for homework, talk about it next lesson. What they're finding is it's the children with the greatest language deficit are making the greatest gains. And when they talk to the children about that, you know, why they're getting on so well with it and why they appear to be enjoying it so much, they say, well, we enjoy being clever. We like finding out this stuff. So that then taps back into the fact we're a challenge-seeking species. We like doing things that are difficult. And so it's kind of joyous when we get this loop going. And so that's it, really, in a not very tight nutshell.
I'm bubbling with responses, and I'm going to go backwards. When I attended your course recently, which I enjoyed so much just before lockdown, you showed us, or you mentioned to us, the video of Austin's butterfly. And just that message of the teachers were happy with the first butterfly that Austin made. But once you nudge the student to improve and improve and improve his butterfly, the year 1 butterfly comes out as a year 6 butterfly because the student had so much more to give. He's just used to a situation where everything is procedural. Finish the sheet, move on to the next sheet, draw another animal. so that opportunity to give students to lean into their work and expect more from themselves is, I think, you know, I was teaching year 5 this week, maths, and I said to them, did you feel learning? Where did you feel learning? And giving them the metacognitive skills to find that moment in their own experience, to reflect on what learning feels like. That's what we want our tutors to be giving students so that they can go back into the classroom and find that joy for themselves. So you mentioned deep work, and I'm into audiobooks. And just as an aside, my kids have been listening to audiobooks since they were very little. So I have Thomas the Tank Engine and Winnie the Pooh and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and everything in between. And what's amazing about that is that I've unlocked language for them higher than their pay grade. So they weren't able to read the books, but they were able to access the literature, and therefore the books become that much more accessible. And that's something that I would recommend to anyone because it's so comfortable to enjoy an audiobook. And then the other area of that was deep work. So to think about your high challenge, low threat, and then to think about deep work as a space that is calm and quiet for you to really focus on your work and not get distracted by pings and peers, then you teach children to concentrate. And you think about Graham Nuttall's work about the secret life of the classroom and how distracting it is, and how we're so much more focused on what the children around us are doing than the teacher in front of us. And all of those distractions mean that we're not really able to concentrate. So what we feel, and we had a fascinating conversation with an agency leader and a school leader who were talking about what happens when tutors go into schools and how there's a halo effect. That as the students discover what learning feels like and have this crucial connection between effort and success, they take it back into the classroom and it has a knock-on effect way beyond the maths intervention that they've received. So we think that there's something that we can do here to help students find that deep space of learning so that it can put them on their feet and help them to get into that virtuous loop that you mentioned.
Yes, I agree. And I don't think we can underestimate the level of distractions that there are for children nowadays. So I think this is an element of the metacognitive work that needs to go on, talking about this. And it's not that it's all bad, but if that's all we do, then what are we missing out on? So there's a lot of evidence that reading for 30 minutes a day does all sorts of good things for us, both emotionally, psychologically, intellectually. So we need to create and model the time and the space to do that, because it's no one will say, do as I do as I say, not do as I do. We've got to be modeling this ourselves and talking about it and children seeing us do it. And I think that's an investment in time. And so I think whether it is within a classroom setting, and lots of secondary schools are doing this now, where there is dedicated reading time, where actually the teacher is reading aloud to the class, or the class are reading just quietly on their own. That needs quite a lot of management, making sure that they're not reading stuff they could have read in primary schools. But, when that's done well, it's done really well. And I would argue in smaller groups as well, or in tutoring situations, that if we think this is an issue, then we invest 10 or 15 minutes where the tutor and the child or the small group, we are just reading in silence, because children have got to experience it so that they then know how worthwhile it is. So your point about leaning in, I think, is a really important one. They've got to be supported to lean in, and that's when the magic happens. Now, I think you've got to be quite brave to make a decision to do that, because tutoring comes with a cost. Everything comes with a cost. And there is sometimes this sense that I've got to pursue content coverage, what I call the curse of content coverage, when actually something slightly different is needed. And I would argue something like this, where it's been identified that could be holding children back, is an investment in in long-term benefits for children, even though it doesn't look as though we're doing something. We are. It's deep work on there.
This week's podcast is a feedback from a cohort that completed the course 2 weeks ago. And one of the tutors there was saying that she was working with a dyslexic child, and she was teaching her English. And so it was heavy work for the child. And whenever she felt the student's energy flagging, she'd just give her a break. And she'd let the student decide if it's going to be a 15 or a 5-minute break. And by giving the student that agency, by the time the student finished with her, she said she was going to be an author when she grows up, because she helped her find the joy in it and took the slog out of it. So we speak to our tutors very much about, on the one hand, to be ambitious with allowing them to access content and surprise themselves with how much they can cover academically, but to be much more responsive. We talk about being a thermostat rather than a thermometer, where you're leading the tone and creating the culture so that your student can be successful as a learner, because you don't have the limitations of crowd control that the teacher is always encumbered with.
Yeah, I think that notion of a thermostat rather than a temperature control is a really, really helpful analogy. Yes, I'm going to reflect on that. Really, really good.
I picked that up, I think, from Seth Godin.
Oh, he's a
big fan of Seth. Yes. He's amazing.
I love that. I love educationalist. Well, he's actually less of an educationalist, isn't he? More of a marketer.
Just before you take us to the next question, Ludo, I just want to share with you, Mary, that I love that you reference who you read, because tutors have to be pulling on these threads, and they're not in the habit of thinking about professional development in the same way that teachers are taught to think about professional development. But professional reading for tutors will be just as valuable as it is for teachers, which you argue, and Dylan Williams also argues, that that's the differentiating factor between people who are improving and not. So we talk about reassessment, where we teach tutors to reflect on their own effectiveness and take that forward and take responsibility for that. So the reading that you can do, for example, in the Chartered College website, where there's just a treasure house of lovely blogs and webinars to binge on, can make all the difference to outcomes for students.
I agree, absolutely. And it's incredibly good value. I'm actually arguing that everyone in school, every school should have at least one person who signed up to the Chartered College, and that is paid for by the school. If a lot of the colleagues you're working with will be self-employed, but you can set that against income. So again, nil net cost to you. I just don't think as a sector we can afford not to be tapping into that. Why wouldn't we? It's all been so beautifully curated to the highest standards, beautifully produced. And so I mention it in every session I speak at.
Yeah, I've noticed. It's a joy to be a part of. It really is. So we have a 20% discount for tutors who complete our course, have a 20% discount as professional affiliates of the Chartered College, which is a pleasure to be able to announce.
And now, a brief word from our founder, Julia Silver.
If you'd like to hear more about the ideas we touch on here, or gain the tools to take your own tutoring to the next level, the Qualification for Tutors could be for you. This live online seminar is facilitated by industry experts who, over 4 Zoom workshops, will cover the foundations of teaching and learning and how it relates to you as a tutor. The workshops are full of rich discussions where you'll learn alongside other tutors and connect on a professional level. We will teach you how to be the kind of tutor every child remembers. Visit our community space at qualifiedtutorcommunity.org and sign up now for our transformative course. We'll see you there.
I love the conversations that veer towards tutoring. That's certainly where I'm coming from. I'm not a teacher myself. I'm a tutor, and it's amazing to see kind of all this books and this research about teaching and drawing that towards tutoring, because obviously the National Tutoring Programme and a general trend towards deploying tutors in the best way possible in schools means that the literature on tutoring is really expanding and growing and becoming something that tutors themselves feel they can read, rather than being out of the reach of tutors, because we've previously been seen as a kind of part-time job and therefore no real exploration of what we're doing. Boo. So, Mary, I'd like to ask, what you think? I don't know how much headspace the NTP has taken up for you, but I'd like to ask what you think the best case scenario for the NTP will be, and what we might need to do in order to get there.
Well, I have to say that when this was first mooted in the summer by Robert Halfon, who chairs the Education Committee, it was a big thumbs up for me, because all the evidence is that for those children who have seriously fallen behind, small group or one-on-one tutoring does make a huge difference. And so I am pleased that this funding has been made available. What I hope is that, and I'm sure it will be the case, that most schools will use this wisely. What I haven't had any insights into is the availability of suitably qualified tutors to do this work. So I think there's been some wider discussions about that and who might tap into becoming part of the accredited programme. It might not be as strong as that, so that the demand is met for this is met by the supply of strong, suitable people to do this work. But overall, I think it is one of the better pieces that's come out of the department, and I'm sure at the prompting of Robert Halfon and his committee.
it's lovely to hear the optimism. And as you know, we're working very hard on making sure that there's plenty of well-qualified tutors. But tell us about the pitfalls of tutors sort of arriving in schools, and how they need to navigate, and how schools need to adjust to make space for them.
So beyond the kind of safeguarding stuff that needs to sit behind all this and those processes, etc., the obligations on the schools are to provide the background information, and I don't mean necessarily hard data, because we know that that's all been distorted by the lockdown, but a thumbnail sketch of why this child or this group of children need additional support, and not just generic support, but if, it's as basic as decoding, then making sure that anyone going into school knows what the if they're going into support sort of phonics work higher up the school, what are the phonics programs that have been used before. So there does need to be a bit of an investment of time from the part of the school to gather that evidence, light touch evidence, so that anyone coming in to support those children is not flying blind. On the part of the tutor going in, I think you really have to behave as a guest. So how would a good guest behave in terms of being as pleasant as possible to everyone we come into contact with? It can be nerve-wracking, but always assume the best of people. I mean, your colleagues will know schools are frantically busy places, but so if things go slightly wrong, then just assume it's, just because, life happens. But to come in with genuine curiosity and willingness to help, which I'm sure is a hallmark of the way your colleagues work in any case. And to think about those things about meeting the child where they are, but then moving them on as swiftly as possible. Because what we don't want to happen is children to get locked into intervention so they're too long. It's got to be as efficient, as purposeful as possible, so that they're back with their peers experiencing a broader curriculum. So some of the things that play into that, the child or the group of children must never feel as though they're a deficit model. And even if they've been made to feel that by casual comments they've heard in school, the tutor has got an opportunity to counter that by saying, I'm just delighted to work with you. It's just going to be really, really purposeful. You look like a great group. So lots of affirmation to begin with. And also just sort of asking them how they feel about school generally. This can be done quite quickly. And what I find interesting is when you talk to children and they're not having a great experience in school, that kind of doesn't matter for the work I'm then going to do. They just like the fact someone has asked them. And anyway, the fact is they are in school, because if they're really not doing well in school, they're very good at absenting themselves. The fact that they're even in the room is a good thing. But you get some really quite good insights into where the child is coming from, and then you can frame some of the conversations around that. And particularly if they say, well, I really don't like reading, if we're focusing on that, I really don't like maths, and then you get some success early on, you're then able to say, listen, you were saying last session, you could now look what you can do. So there's subtle growth mindset underpinning what the tutors do. But I'm sure you have all those conversations and structures in place for your colleagues anyway.
We certainly do, but I love that phrase of being a guest. So we talk about the 7 P's of professionalism, to be polite and punctual and presentable and positive and persistent, and a few more P's as well. But I think that the guest needs to be all of those things as well, and also being able to roll with the punches when the timetable flips, and especially if bubbles are going to be closing because coronavirus hit this pocket of the school or that pocket of the school. There's going to be all sorts of flexibility that has to go alongside your persistence and your ambition and your commitment in order for you to be able to work in a school.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what goes a long way in that is if you were to arrive intending to do some work with one child or group of children, and that lot you find have been bundled off to self-isolate, it you create a huge amount of goodwill. Say, well, I'm obviously not needed for them. Is there anywhere else that might not have been identified, but, my time is here, that would be helpful just to work with a child or a small group of children for that time instead? Now, quite often that won't be taken up because they might have other things in place. But my goodness, the goodwill that goes sitting behind that, because what we want is the relationship between the professionals, so the professionals within the school setting and the your colleagues who are visiting, to be as fruitful as possible.
That's right. That's really right. That's just glorious to give tutors that permission to understand the school context in that way and be contributors.
Yeah, that will give
Ludo, keep going.
Our tutors massive confidence.
Yeah.
They've been treated to something pretty special in the last couple of weeks with Dame Alison, and now hearing this from you, Mary. I think it's a scary thought for a tutor to go into a school and work alongside teachers and work in the school environment, because we're not trained to do that. In fact, until now, we weren't trained to do anything because we've never been trained. But we're not taught how to work alongside teachers. And I think it's really very reassuring to hear that there is a system to do this. There is a way of working alongside them, and that there should be no fear to working alongside teachers, because really good teachers are ones who are happy to collaborate and work with others, because education it's not a competition. Well, unfortunately, it is at the moment in terms of the way our system's set up, but it's not a competition. For me, it's very reassuring to hear this, but also for those tutors that we serve and in our community and that are able to access this kind of this dialogue. It's really very positive. Now, Adrian Conway, who sadly can't join us today, but who was with us last week when we spoke to Dame Alison, came up with this wonderful question to really challenge Dame Alison to delve into the depths of her mind, to think about the wider picture. Now, we asked Dame Alison this question: if you could wave a magic wand over the educational landscape, what would you see? And she came up with a response that talked about how she'd like schools to be a place where there can be no limits on what students can achieve. So I'm afraid, Mary, that answer is taken. But if you could wave a magic wand over the educational landscape, what would you see?
So if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that every professional involved in children's learning had access to the high quality evidence from the cognitive science that really makes a difference to children's learning, which is why I so rate Alison's book. So, for instance, I am going to be doing an interview this afternoon, so I'm just looking to pull it up, a recording myself, by which time I will have put some makeup on,
Yes.
Just come out. So this is Zoe and Mark Enser's Generative Learning in Action. Now, what we've got here is not just that, but all the other work that's been coming out from Willingham, from Brown, from Lemov, from Nuttall over the years, is a gold mine which is not yet available to every member of the professional community. So that would be what I would want my magic wand to do. I'm actually working on addressing some of that now, to make things absolutely available to anyone and everyone. And linked to that, I would take it further. I would strip out in the performance appraisal systems anything to do with teacher performance related to numbers and data. Completely distorts professional practice. And what we know that the schools that are doing the best work, and individuals as well who are really motoring in their own professional practice and thinking, is that they're engaged in this work. And it's not that we take it lock, stock and barrel. We take the attitude that Dylan William has. We pick the best bets for our contexts. And the great thing that happens in sectors, in parts of the sector where this is happening, there are significant gains in children's learning, and it reduces workload. Now, it's that way round. We want to have a greatest possible impact on children's learning, but a byproduct is that it significantly reduces workload. And so that's why I just think it's so important. And that's why I endorse so much what Alison and her colleagues are doing at the Chartered College.
It's a small piece, isn't it, that will have a massive trickle effect. Will you talk to us about your new platform, the film?
Yes. So I've decided to develop a platform. I'd already got one for my own work where I couldn't get into schools or for bookings because there just wasn't enough time. And so those have been made available. But what I found during lockdown, when I put out shorter films on just things like differentiation, things like use of questioning, is that people were absolutely just had a hunger for this material. It wasn't just mine, it was the research-ed homework that they put out there. Children Teaching School Alliance, Seneca Learning, lots of organizations were putting material out and people were just thrilled to have it. So I had been intending to expand my own offer. And then I realized actually what would be better would be not just my own work, but others' work as well. So a separate platform which is dedicated to video on demand is currently being created, and it's going to be launching in the next few weeks. We're calling it the Soak, and it's going to operate on a Netflix principle of short films for opening up discussions and resources to take it further if people want to. But I'm absolutely passionate about getting this out to anyone who needs it. So it's going to be no charge for initial teacher trainers. And trainees. It's going to be no charge for newly qualified teachers. And also, no questions asked. Anyone who is skint, it can just email in and say, and we'll no questions, don't need any reasons. They will have a year's subscription. For those who can afford to pay, it's probably going to be about £8 a month. But I think the greatest demand is coming from, in my conversations, is coming from schools and trusts, where we can bring that £8 down to around £1 a month. So the aim is to get out a huge range of material, evergreen. It's going to be added to the whole time, and we're going to be launching with about 70 films in a few weeks' time.
Sounds so exciting.
Quite exciting. It might fall flat on its face, but there we go.
Mary, could you extend your initial teacher access to qualified tutors, please?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's another. I tell you why, because as you were explaining it, I thought to myself, well, that's high challenge, low threat, isn't it? Being able to watch videos that will give me the food for thought in my own time and space will enrich my professional performance without making me feel that I have to be in a specific place at a high cost and be surrounded by people who may or may not know more than me.
Exactly. No, very happy to do that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. I think it's been a really fruitful 56 minutes.
Yeah, that's not the first time that word's been used today. I think
I'm sorry that I joined you over 5 minutes later. Because I
you're right, 51.
And then I started nodding. There we go.
Did we cover everything, Mary? Was there anything else that you wanted to share with tutors before we wrap up?
No, I would just affirm the work that you are doing in putting in place some structures to support their professional growth and accreditation. Really important work, Julia. And I would also say that the difference that they're making to some of our most vulnerable children, and by vulnerability, I don't just mean poverty. These are just children who need additional kind, robust support. And so just to believe that what they do matters, and it matters enormously. So I hope that's helpful.
So glad I asked.
And you joining us today will matter a lot to those tutors who then obviously pass on that knowledge, the continuous learning cycle. Thank you so much, Mary. That was really an amazing 40 minutes. I feel like I'm also a huge fan of Sudoku, and actually I'm also challenging myself to attack the kind of what do they call them, super fiendish ones. I feel like Sudoku is a hobby that doesn't get enough mainstream airtime or appreciation, so thank you for bringing that as well. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Mary. And really, there's so much that our tutors can take from that. I hope you enjoyed talking about it. Great, and read Mary's books. That's the final thing. Of course, Back on Track is recently released, and there's a whole series before that as well. We'll be keeping all podcast listeners up to date on that.
Thanks.
Well, it's been a pleasure joining you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Bye, Mary. Thanks for listening to the Qualified Tutor podcast, where tutors share their expertise to support the tutoring community. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join our Qualified Tutor community at www.qualifiedtutorcommunity.org or find it in the show notes below. We exist to connect, share, and learn with you because tutoring is a small job that makes a big difference.